Welcome everybody to Popular Music Books in Process, back from the summer break and ready for some noise. Today, we'll be talking about extreme music, Michael Tau's book. But first, let me just say a couple of words about the series and things to come. We're a joint venture of the Journal of Popular Music Studies of IASPM US, which just put out a call for presentations for a conference held with the global version of IASPM in Minneapolis this summer. So take a look out for that. And of the POP conference, which should have its call out in a couple more weeks. So many possibilities for talking about music, dare I say it, in person. Thanks as well to our co-organizers, Carl Wilson, who'll be fielding the Q&A questions in a little bit here, Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, and Gus Stadler. If you're interested, we've been doing, and new to this series, we've been doing it for a couple of years now, and there's some 60-odd previous presentations sitting on my YouTube channel, waiting to be loved. Next week, not next week, sorry, we're bi-weekly. So in 2 weeks in the series, we've got Louis Niebuhr talking about his book, Menergy, San Francisco's Gay Disco Sound, in conjunction with Barry Walters, who's working on his own book, Mighty Real, The Music That Built LGBTQ America. So that's in 2 weeks. But for today, it's all about extreme music being published by Feral House in, what, November are we thinking now?
Yeah.
More or less November.
Yeah.
And in particular, we'll be focusing on a portion of the book because it does have many short, sharp spikes for us to linger over and feel delicious about, but we can only do so many in the course of this hour and still have time for conversation. Michael Tau is a music writer and an academic psychiatrist living in Toronto, Canada. He's written extensively about music for places including Sound Projector Magazine, Broken Pencil, Foxy Digitalis, Decoder Magazine, and Vital Weekly, always with a focus on experimental and fringe music. Extreme Music is his first book, and to accompany it, he has started a website. Perhaps you want to post that in the chat, anomalyindex.com, which, as he tells us, produces deep dive articles examining specific extreme music releases through various interviews. And he's going to be talking today with someone well positioned to ask questions about noise, Marc Masters, who we know from his writing for Bandcamp, Pitchfork, and The Wire. Before that, he also wrote for Washington Post, Rolling Stone, Spin, The Village Voice, and all the legacy publications that we're hoping will continue into the future. His first book was called No Wave, about exactly that movement in music and film in late 80s New York, published by Black Dog in 2007. And he's got another book on the way, we're told just turned into the publisher and hopefully coming out about a year from now. High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, to be published by UNC Press in 2023. Our usual orders of operation for the series, after Michael and Marc have had a chance to talk, we'll have an active Q&A with the folks in attendance today, but we encourage you really at any point in the session to put your comments in the chat. We'll share those with our presenters after the fact, and so there's a way to record questions, but also just comments, things that occur to you as you're listening. Keeps you active, keeps us all interested. All right, that's it from me. Have fun, guys.
Okay, hello everyone. So first of all, thanks to the Popular Music Books in Process co-organizers, Kimberly, Francesca, Gus, Eric, and Carl, for allowing me to take part in this wonderful series. And thank you to Marc, whose writing I really do admire, for taking part in today's session. I'm gonna give a short PowerPoint presentation just to overview this chapter in lieu of a reading, because I think it'll just make a bit more sense if I summarize the content of this one chapter. What you're looking at here is the best thing I've ever done in PowerPoint, this one slide. And I don't know how I created it, but I think it looks really good. So let me just do this in a way that's not going to cut off the screen. Okay. So first, just a summary of the book itself, very briefly. My book looks at several conceptual extremes that appear in popular music. For example, subcultures of music so loud that it's comprised entirely of unchanging blocks of harsh noise, something called harsh noise wall, or forms of extreme metal that are exceptionally vulgar, like a genre called gore grind, which is all about blood and guts, and other things like, very elaborate packaging concepts or music that comes out in really esoteric formats. And the core assumption behind the book is that the ideas and sounds that lurk within the deepest margins of the musical world are relevant and important and worth hearing about. So today's focus is just on one chapter, which is the chapter called Fast, and it looks at forms of electronic dance music with extremely fast beats, well beyond the usual norms we associate with popular EDM. But first, I just want to provide some quick history. So within electronic music, the 80s saw the advent of two key early forms of electronic dance music, specifically house and techno. Both genres use a 4/4 kick drum beat, so like do, 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 called 4 to the floor. And the beats were generally in the range of 120 up to 150 beats per minute. In the 90s, some EDM or electronic dance music went darker and faster, what's often referred to as hardcore rave music. And some of this was within the 150 to 180 beats per minute range. So you may have heard of extreme subgenres like happy hardcore and a Dutch genre called gabber, where they really took as their identity the idea of these very fast beats. And then, of course, there's also drum and bass and jungle, which use break beats, they're more irregular than the 4 to the floor beats, but also can get quite fast. However, in the early 90s, some producers started experimenting with pushing beats per minute above the 200 BPM threshold. So specifically, in 1992, a Rotterdam hardcore act named Euromasters released this record, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. And it was a modest hit. It reached the Dutch top 40. But on the 12-inch version, they included this remix that went up to 250 beats per minute, which at the time was really an unparalleled height. The next year, Cybersonic, which maybe some folks here have heard of these folks, the duo of Dan Bell and Richie Houghton, they put out a record whose B-side was this track Machine Gun. And that record started at 140 beats per minute, then doubled to 280, sort of mimicking a machine gun fire. And interestingly, Houghton later would say that this record was meant to be a statement about their contempt for the excesses of the rave scene at the time. The same year, Moby, he put out a B-side to his hit, I Feel It. So I Feel It actually appeared on the Cool World soundtrack, if people remember that movie. But the B-side was called 1000. And the concept was it started at a normal BPM and gradually escalated to over 1,000 beats per minute. And that record ended up listed in the Guinness Book of Records for being the fastest song at the time. So taxonomy is important in electronic music, as it is in many genres. And the term speedcore emerged in the late 90s to describe EDM that went faster than 250 beats per minute. So to give you a sense of the scale, consider that 180 BPM, that's equivalent to, tapping your finger 3 times within 1 second. So 240 would be 4 times 1 second. If you try it out, you can hear, it quickly sort of loses the familiar dance type rhythm that we associate with EDM. And that term, the first appearance of the term speedcore actually dates back to 1993. In the single by a New York City act called DOA, or the Disciples of Annihilation. And they were known for merging metal samples with hardcore rave music. And the track in question uses samples from the Typo Negative cover of Summer Breeze, which seems like a fun fact. That track didn't actually go above 250 beats per minute, but a 1994 track by them reached 280 beats per minute. And they were extreme enough to be signed by Earache Records, the grindcore and extreme metal label that at the time was dabbling in electronic music, I believe, just for a brief period of time. But it was really the creation of the United Speedcore Nation, a record label and message board that catalyzed the speedcore community. So that message board was responsible for linking fans and producers. And unfortunately, as far as I know, the archives are all lost, but it was really a hub for people who are getting into this music. And so this, just to get a sense, this is the kind of bare bones design that some of the records that came out on United Speed Coordination that they used. And some of these records are worth quite a bit of money right now, I understand. A key moment in SpeedCore's evolution was the move from using drum machines to instead using fully digital production, which allowed producers to create, the bass drum, the four to the floor bass drum hit with tones as opposed to a drum machine, which allowed them to go, as fast as a computer's processing speed would allow them. And a 2001 release by this pretty prominent Dutch producer, Noise Kick, that's him in the corner. He's got the sort of the wearing a mask while DJing thing as a trademark. One of his tracks in 2001 had a 666 BPM remix, and that was a fairly popular touchstone in the genre. So as we cross the 500 beat per minute mark, I'll stop here to reflect on a few different ways of thinking about this super fast music. So Simon Reynolds, who I spoke to while drafting this chapter, describes what he calls the zone of fruitless intensification. He explains how the shift from 120 to 150 beats per minute, when that happened in electronic music, it really felt like a radical shift in speed and intensity. Conversely, the rise, the subsequent rise from 150 to 180 beats per minute, it didn't produce the same escalation in excitement and intensity. And there's sort of a law of diminishing returns when you get to a certain point. So he sees the hyperspeeds of SpeedCore as being victims of this zone of fruitless intensification. And I think he would also argue that the same principle occurs in a lot of extreme music scenes, not necessarily with the variable of speed, but with any number of other variables. Another Reynoldsian concept that I really like is this idea that music advances through self-parody. So as we saw, what started off as a joke B-side by Moby or a bit of satire by Richie Houghton and Dan Bell became a serious musical development for a subculture of electronic producers. And lastly, when I was creating this chapter, I was interviewing, a number of people in the SpeedCore world. And there, this idea of an arms race or a pissing contest where people are constantly incentivized to up the ante when it comes to tempo is another way of thinking about this. But to get back to the SpeedCore story, briefly, the phenomenon went global. There was a Canadian SpeedCore resistance that put out a number of records. A couple of prominent Italian producers, Comprex and Frasbase, were associated with an Italian SpeedCore label. There's this eccentric Japanese SpeedCore producer named MIDI or M1DY, who that's him, and he's ran these labels called Pork and Mattis Chickendom. I really like these kind of esoteric names. And then Australia's Passenger of Shit brought a cross breed of SpeedCore rife with grotesque images of feces and genitalia. This was the least offensive center label I could find. But things didn't stop with SpeedCore. So this term splittercore started getting used to describe music with beats per minute above 500. And it's believed to have taken its name from this 2005 DJ set by a producer named Pengo. One of the SpeedCore producers I spoke to sees splittercore as the result of this pissing contest in the mid-2000s that came about because people were able to put albums on the internet through net labels due to the improved internet speeds of the era. So, as you can see, some of the aspects of this genre really were facilitated by the internet. That's a look at some of the visual aesthetic of the splittercore scene, a couple of compilations on splittercore labels. And the final train station on our journey is extratone, which refers to electronic music with beats per minute above 1,000. So this arcane corner of music emerged from the work of two producers, Laurentium and this shadowy figure named Heinrich 3600 BPM, who developed a cult following while sharing tracks and theory on the United SpeedCore Nation message board. And this term extratone refers to the phenomenon where beats at a certain speed stop being perceived as individual beats and instead become tones. So a lot of the genre is, playing with this pattern of transgressing the limit between tone and beat. Heinrich 3600, the father of extra tone, he released his experimental tracks on obscure CDRs on his own label. That's one of them in the top right corner there, reaching a maximum, an outlandish maximum speed of over 600,000 on this one record, which that's the one in the corner. Though these records were very obscure, they inspired a significant primarily online scene with its own popular artists, chief among them this gentleman annoying Ringtone, who interestingly, the more theoretical, experimental folks disparage him because he's seen as this kind of person who took extra tone towards a pop direction. So it's this whole little world within this relatively obscure subculture. So within the speedcore continuum, producers, there's not so much extra tone producers in splittercore and speedcore that they'll often will flip between different subgenres, and a lot of tracks will only spend a relatively small proportion of their duration within a specific high BPM zone. And a lot of the music exists at the intersection of extreme electronic music and noise. So you'll see a lot of crossovers between those two scenes. And producers often show a form of taxonomic hyper-enthusiasm with all of these different subgenres and tangents that have come about, some of which are listed here: flashcore, terrorcore, some are more country-based. So to tie it all together, why should you care about this strange tangent of electronic dance music? For one, I think that even highly obscure fringe music is worth taking seriously, particularly music as conceptually driven as this. Within my book, speedcore is simply one case study of a logical extreme, in this case, an extreme of tempo, that exists within the margins of popular music. And though these extremes are often, very esoteric, they represent principles that I think percolate through popular music as a whole. For example, there's the fetish for hard and fast within hardcore punk, which itself was once a very fringe genre, or there's the gratuitous imagery of a lot of metal music, the conceptual purity of noise music. Even house music started off with producers just taking certain features of disco music and then carrying them to their logical extremes. Finally, I think we should take seriously the idea that music can advance through self-parody. Something can start off as a joke and later become the impetus for an entire subculture. So that is my presentation, and I will stop sharing. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks for that, Michael. So yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is kind of what you bring up in that last slide. The interesting thing about this section of the book, especially with a book like yours that is so much about categories and names that either the artists have chosen or other people have put on genres and things, that's a hard kind of thing to write because it's so hard to define genres, and a lot of times artists don't want to be defined by genres, so they'll push back if you try. In this section, you've got probably about the most clearest genre delineation I've ever seen. The beats per minute define which genre is which as they go higher, which I think is really interesting, and especially just in terms of it as an experimental music. But also, like you mentioned, like that puts some of this music into the Guinness Book of World Records. And in some ways, it seems like it's really, an outsider could view it as it's strictly about numbers. And when I was reading this section, I kind of thought of the parallel between like something like track and field versus a sport like football or baseball, where track and field basically just measures how far you can jump, and other sports kind of like have a strategy that you have to think about, and there's chess aspects and things like that. So I'm curious, what would your response be to the idea that maybe this is strictly just about numbers and technicality? I'm sure you think there's a lot more to it than that. How would you describe what more there is to it than just the limits that they're pushing past?
Yeah, so because a lot of the producers, don't kind of stick to one category, and not everyone who's an extra tone artist thinks that everything should be 1,000 beats per minute. I think the numbers are, I guess, they've probably been emphasized when it comes to the categories because it's the most salient, obvious way of categorizing the music. But I think that the producers, my general sense from them was that this idea of escalating BPMs was one way of thinking about music, but really a lot of it came down to, creating exciting electronic music, oftentimes being in the lower categories, and then sort of playing with this idea of suddenly ratcheting up the beats per minute. So a lot of the productions, they'll spend, a couple of seconds at 1,000 beats per minute, and then they'll go back down to something more palatable. So that's kind of where the production skill comes into play. I think, I hadn't thought about this, but I really like how you point out how a lot of artists sort of balk at the idea of their music being categorized, but within these subcultures, there's a huge focus on what is the label that I'm going to use. And I think you also see that in extreme metal. You might see that in forms of harsh noise, but you don't necessarily see it in every scene. From what I gather, there's sort of a joy in coming up with your own subgenre. It's a way of making the music more individualized. And so I think people embrace these terms because it's sort of like, oh, maybe I can carve out my own world of electronic music. There'd be some producers who are like, one of them was like, I came up with this idea of shaman core. So that's what my music is. I'm hoping to make it big. So it's a way of expressing ideas by self-categorizing, whereas other people might, express their ideas by saying, I don't belong in any one category. I guess the other thing is it allows sort of like-minded people to come around, and a lot of this came about with the internet, the message board. Having a label allows people to be attracted to it and then collaborate and develop a community. So I don't know if I answered your question entirely. I think the whole idea of music being categorized by the BPM number, that's a valid criticism. But certainly the producers don't see themselves as just about the number.
Yeah, and I didn't really personally, at least, I didn't mean it as a criticism. Like I like that aspect of it. In fact, it's kind of cool to be so blunt about this is the difference between the music that I'm making and the music someone else is making. I think I'm also kind of curious. What do you think about the music beyond the BPM is interesting or worth studying? I mean, you hinted at it, or not, you said it in your last slide about how there are definitely valuable things to this that can apply beyond the microgenres that are in. But I'm curious, the sort of the musical quality and maybe even the emotional quality of the different categories here and genres, or just the use of beats, how you would qualify the sort of musical and emotional aspects of that music, the music that you're talking about in this section.
Yeah, I guess I wonder. I'm gonna guess maybe you've noticed this too, Mark, in some of these worlds of deeply experimental worlds of music. There's just immense levels of productivity by artists, by labels. It's like people are putting things out nearly on a daily basis. So we see that in the noise scene, right? Like a cassette label that'll somehow have 100 releases in the space of 1 year. And that's very much the case with a lot of this. A lot of the net labels just produce flurries of releases. And I generally, I think of this as being a form of folk art, right? It's not so much about, creating this polished masterpiece that's been worked on for a year. There are artists who sort of devote more time to individual releases than others. But it seems more like this idea of throwing out as many ideas as possible, kind of putting things out quickly so it's straight from idea to production. And then also a lot of focus on, the terminology, like the album name and the titles and the visual aesthetic, which I tried to show you guys a little bit of. And so I guess I think a lot of it is ideas driven and sometimes comes off as, very ramshackle, and there's a certain joy to that. I think for me, what I've taken is I think I'm most drawn to the ideas. I can't say I listen to splitter core compilations when I'm not when I wasn't writing this article. But yeah, I kind of think of it as a folk art idiom, and people are doing all these things and sharing them with one another. And it's exciting to hear the weird things that they come up with, even if it's, some of it doesn't seem terribly pre-calculated or, yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know what you think, Mark, because you've devoted a lot of time to experimental and noise music. I wonder if that resonates with you, the idea of folk art.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly the idea of the artist being prolific. You don't see a lot of people dabbling in genres like this. They either make 1,000 releases or they're not interested at all. And that definitely, yeah, there's a folk art aspect to that, and also sort of a diary aspect. Their art becomes sort of more about this is where I am at every given moment, rather than I'm building up to one thing this year or one thing even this month or whatever. So that's definitely something I feel, because I wasn't super familiar with the music just discussing this, but it's got a lot to do with the music I am familiar with. It's in the rest of the book for sure in that way. But the kind of flip interesting thing too is you mentioned Moby and Houghton, and so there is some relation to popular music in this speed music. And I'm just curious, what are those sort of the only ways they ever connected, or do you find that there's sort of a continuum in between these kind of extremes and some of what bubbles up into the mainstream?
Yeah, I think I think the speedcore producers took cues from things that were happening in the more popular area of electronic dance music. So like some of those DOA or the Moby track or the Cybersonic track. I'm not sure that the communication goes both ways. Certainly, there have been more prominent EDM electronic dance music artists who've dabbled in really rapid tempos, like Atari Teenage Riot being one who they're doing it. And then there's the offshoot of drum and bass breakcore, which gets pretty fast at times. And so like artists like Venetian Snares, those are some of the more, I guess, higher profile acts that have dabbled in really rapid genres, not 1,000 beats per minute. But yeah, I think owing to the zone of fruitless intensification, there's a certain cutoff where it just doesn't become appealing to the ear of the casual listener, and it becomes really, within the subculture, which I suppose is true of like subgenres of metal and punk, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Cool. What we were talking about with people being so prolific in genres like this, what kind of challenges did that present for researching? Probably pretty much your whole book, but especially this section.
Yeah, I think it's something that's always kind of mystified me, like the idea that someone could put out so much music in such a short period of time. So it was a frequent question I asked people in multiple chapters of the book, is like, how did you do this? Like, why is there 100 releases within the space of a month? And when I got answers, it was really, people would comment on the hyper productivity and say it was really about getting ideas forward, getting concepts forward as quickly as possible. I think when I was researching this, I tried my best to hit some of the prominent people if I could get them, as well as trying to get some of the less prominent artists within different genres to understand, like, oh, how are people who are the thought leaders of a genre thinking about this, and how are people who are like, they're producers, but they're also audience members, how do they think about this? So the genre, the kind of case example would be the chapter about Harsh Noise Wall, which is this like obscure, it's this offshoot of harsh noise music where the idea is that it's blocks of noise that remain unchanging for up to an hour at a time. So you play it at one moment, you play it 20 minutes later, it's going to sound exactly the same. And there's the thought leader is this gentleman called Romain Perot or Vomir. I guess the other thought leader would be Sean McKinley or the Rita, both of whom sat down and talked with me. They're very, very friendly, very thoughtful. But then I tried to also hit some of the, I don't want to say rank and file, the people who were producing this but weren't the big names. And it's interesting to see, what the experience is like as primarily as a producer versus what the experience is like primarily as a listener. So I've tried to carry that through the book as a whole. Sometimes we don't hear about the listeners, we hear more about the big names.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious what that's a sort of another challenge that springs off of that is describing this music without pinning it down too much, but also assuming that even like nobody who even you probably are never going to listen to all this music again, and there's no one who's going to read it who's going to be able to go and, oh, as soon as he mentions this, I'm going to go listen to it. But at the same time, you don't want to get trapped in like your own specific description of something that has so many mutations. And so how did you navigate that? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Do you mean so like how to sort of corral all of this different music in a way that I can describe it and speak semi-definitively about it?
Yeah, and that somebody can get a sense of what it
Right.
what it must be like to listen to it, that probably aren't going to, or probably aren't going to anyway.
Yeah. So, where, like, I guess, I give the example of tapping your finger 4 times in a second to try to come up with these kind of conceptual metaphors that people get a sense of what this thing would sound like. Or harsh noise, it's the same. You put it in one moment to the next, it's going to sound the same throughout. So I mean, I struggle, like I imagine everyone does, with how to describe the sound of music. And where possible, I try to avoid like describing in detail what something sounds like, and in the book sort of try to focus on the concepts themselves, like what attracts the artist to the concepts, why have these niches of music emerged that are centered around one or another extreme concept. So when I describe the music, it is, as you say, Mark, purely in the service of like giving someone a sense of what this thing sounds like. The chapter, it's like there's a chapter on extremely long compositions, some of which are like billions of years long. So those were a tough slog. And where possible, I just kind of say like, okay, if you listen at this moment, you're going to hear a few vague pulse tones. But I guess I try not to get too excessive over describing the details of what something sounds like.
Sure.
I mean, I echo that for you, Mark. You've written extensively about experimental music. You find a way of making it digestible.
Right. Well, I have like 5 words and I rearrange them every review. Yeah, no, it's tough. It's tough. And a lot of times the instinct is to not want to do that because you're narrowing it down, and the experience is supposed to be the part that's kind of the ineffable part of it. But I thought you did a good job of like I feel like I got a sense of what this music sounds like to a degree, at least, without listening to it myself. I'm curious about this concept that you say that Simon mentioned first, this concept of advancement through self-parody. I'm curious, both in this section on fast music, but also through the whole book, how much of that do you think is part of it, of a conscious thing that a lot of these artists are doing? Because I mean, to me, I love that aspect of it, and whether I don't either, whether it be self-parody or just sort of absurdity, with being able to tell that the people know there's something funny about what they're doing, even though it's still serious. I mean, the section on vulgar music, with the lists of band names and their long songs that have all these weird medical and organs mentioned and medical procedures. I just think that stuff's hilarious to me, but but not in a way that I feel like I'm laughing at them. I think it's cool that they're doing it, and they're pushing limits, and they're trying something that most people would think that you would never name a song something like that. So I'm curious if you got a sense, either with these specific fast artists or in general, how common is it for an artist to sort of acknowledge that, yeah, there's some parody and absurdism involved in what I'm doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've been trying to think of concrete other examples of when genres have spawned from that, and gore grind was, I think, was exactly it, right? Because it emerged, like the band Carcass created this record, which was meant to be a statement that a pro-veganism statement. It's like, we're going to put all this gore on the cover. This is all human gore. How can you justify eating meat but also find this disgusting, right? And then it got co-opted by a bunch of individual artists and bands who created this whole subculture of music where the subject matter is all really gross gore. The images are all like autopsy photos and stuff, and the terminology is just quotes, lengthy quotes, track titles will be lengthy lines from medical dictionaries and stuff. So people end up taking it seriously, even though the original intention was not that. But I think like it's also important not to underestimate the level of awareness of the producers who are creating this music, right? Like speedcore, the visual aesthetic is very colorful and there's a lot of goofiness, right? Wearing masks, creating cover art that's really silly. I think some parts of it are serious, and I think people also have a sense of kind of self-humility and like it's funny to make music that goes up to 1,000 beats per minute. It's ridiculous. It sounds jarring and silly. I think a lot of the producers, like they carry their tongue in their cheek sometimes when they're creating this, and they enjoy the medium of being able to work with these strange experimental concepts.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sort of the flip side of that, the parody and the absurdity and the humor aspect, is that I imagine some of the people involved in the speedcore and other subgenres in this specific category must have at least a little bit of sense of there's some socio-political, maybe either be commentary or just statements being made. I mean, obviously Atari Teenage Riot was all about that, but they're sort of more extreme example of a kind of a political band in this realm of a sound. But I wonder how often does that part of what's going on with this too, any kind of political commentary or social commentary happening with increasing speeds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've not thought about that. I'm trying to think of the kind of things that I saw, track titles, producer names. You're right that often there's like a big focus on the text, right? A big focus on the track listings or the album titles, because the music is so arcane. I guess you see this in certain forms of noise music too. Like someone will have this idea really unrelated to noise. I'm thinking of the Rita, whose like passions are certain forms of clothing, sharks. And so they'll put out like reams of music and it'll all have sharks on the cover because this person is obsessed with sharks. I know that's not social political, but I think people do the same thing. I wish I had something more intelligent to say about that. Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, and it's tough with music like that. I mean, you kind of have to redefine what the idea of political and social commentary are with music, any music without words, number one, but especially music that's so much about experimenting with form, which can be seen in itself as a political statement. The fact that you can even take these forms and break them up and stretch them so far. You also,
yeah, I know Gabber was very much about like the Gabber subgenre of electronic music was very about like the Netherlands being this like leader in electronic music versus other scenes, and then there was a Amsterdam versus Rotterdam rivalry that was going on. So I don't want to describe it as nationalist music, but I think there were these sort of like there was the arms race between different genres of music, and they're like we're the most extreme. But I don't know that it got any more political than just sort of that. Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation too the role of the internet, and I mean some of this started before the internet was even a viable way to talk about or share the music, right? I mean, as early as the 80s or even earlier, I guess. So do you think that the subsequent genres after that are they kind of things that wouldn't even exist if the internet hadn't come along, or did the internet just sort of inflate the pace or the breadth of what was happening in fast music?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, like you said, the germs of this started before the internet was a common experience for everyone. I think that the form that things took, I don't think it would have occurred without the internet, without the message board communities, and it continues to evolve to this day. Like since I wrote this chapter, there's been further kind of developments in speedcore and extra tone and stuff. And so there definitely is this acceleration process that happens. I think it's completely internet mediated. Same is seen, like I think a lot of the scenes that are described in the book same thing, right? They emerge, like noise emerges well before the internet era, and then it picks up, and now there's just this combinatorial explosion of people creating stuff that they share online. So I don't think this stuff exists without the internet. And there's that key technological shift, which would have happened sort of roughly at the same time the internet was happening, where people could start producing this stuff with just programs they could download off the internet, and home produce music that could go up to whatever BPM faster than a drum machine. I think that's an important factor, as it has been for home recorded and home produced music as a whole. The dawn of audio production software, and net labels. Like, do people remember net labels? It's like they still exist, but there was definitely this boom in net labels that occurred in a certain period. Now I guess it's just Bandcamp and but at one point, like, people would just put out tons of music on their net label, and that was the way that this music was shared. They still exist. I just a lot of them go through Bandcamp now, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
I get the sense, but I might be wrong about this, that among the different kind of segments and categories you discuss in the book, the fast music one is sort of on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of like object, like the physical releases and limited releases. And I mean, in a way that it seems like that would make the internet even more powerful for genre, like when people aren't as concerned about having one of 5 CDRs of this music as opposed to noise. And is that true? And do you think that there's any specific reason why? Is this because it was mostly a lot of it was dance and club based to begin with, or?
Yeah, I guess like electronic music is inherently technological, and so I don't know if that it kind of people were like immediately drawn to sharing things online and using that as a format. Like a lot of the early stuff came out on vinyl, and that's become quite collectible. But I think a lot of the DJs, like a lot of the speedcore producers, are sort of DJs first and foremost, and they all moved to digital forms of DJing sets, right? So it made sense to share the music, online, so that it could be played in DJ sets. I mean, I'll say is there any joy like owning a limited to 5 CDR of a noise release? Like, it's such a pleasure, right?
Right.
And I was thinking, because Marc, your book is coming out, and it's all about the history of the cassette. And one of the sections of my book looks at the kind of the more obscure formats that music has been released on, like micro cassettes and floppy disks, where it's all really about the medium, right? It's about this wonderful arcane collectible medium. So that's a big thing in these subgenre experimental music. Is your book going to look at kind of the boom of the limited to whatever cassette releases that emerged in the 80s and have carried forward since then?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the underground tape culture in the 80s and beyond grew out of mail art. So it was really basically about somebody making one tape, sending it to someone else, them sending them back a tape or adding to it or a different tape. And so those become sort of limited releases on their own, although they're not really even releases. They're more like correspondence. Beyond that, I mean, there certainly were kind of limited edition cassette kind of fetishing in the underground with cassettes, but I don't know that there was ever sort of an equivalent to the anti-record, which is something you cover a little bit in the book, which is something I've always been interested in. Musical releases that aren't even really about the music on them, or there might not even be music on them. It's an object, an art object that has some relation to music, more so than that it's just a carrier or a format for music. That I've always found that pretty interesting, and I'm curious how you went about looking at that, because that's such a wide and sort of undefined genre of art that it can be kind of an incredible rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, for sure. And there have been anti-cassettes that have come out, but certainly it started with the record. I would say that was probably the section that was the hardest. to put together, just because, like you say, it's sort of, it's not condensed around one specific niche or scene. There are a lot of different people who created anti-records and anti-cassettes and anti-CDs for many different reasons. So trying to pull it all together and connect with the people who created them was a unique challenge. Some of that stuff is, like you say, from the world of fine arts. Some of what makes it seem like music is the fact that record labels put it out, even though, you know, it would be like a record contained in a locked box that no one would open, or a record that didn't have any grooves on it. So yeah, I guess that's more of an idea than a scene. Like anti-releases that can't be released, which makes it a lot harder to encapsulate and try to figure out, you know, what it's all about for the purposes of a book chapter. But there was I remember the most noteworthy anti-cassette I can think of is someone took an took a tape, removed the magnetic tape, and replaced it with you know, that like strawberry licorice string, like the string candy. So it was a tape which I guess you could put in a tape player and try to play the strawberry lace, but it would, I'm guessing, ruin your cassette player. That's the most memorable. Or once someone melted a cassette and that was the thing. Another one. Yeah,
I think it's just great, really bad of me because I'm forgetting the name of the artist that I wrote about in the book that did this, but it's Japanese. I think it was Hijo Kaiden put out a tape that was a broken tape in a box, and the way to listen to it was to shake it around.
Right.
But that kind of points me to a little interesting thing about this book is you wrote it basically, at least the structure is a taxonomy. So each section has its kind of walls between the other sections in terms of some definitions and some scenes that happen at different places or at different times. But obviously there's a lot of connections between, like, I mean, the fast section being so based in, you know, people who are DJs or dance music, probably a lot of those people don't know a lot about, say, noise music or harsh noise or whatever, but there still seem to be a lot of commonality between those things. I would think in a way that would also almost make it harder to separate things out. It's great that they have these connections because that's why they can exist in one book together. But did it make it a challenge to know which parts to separate out from each other? Or?
Yeah. It's kind of like at any fringe, it all becomes noise is sort of what happens, right? So like the extra tone artists sort of share a continuum with noise, but their subculture doesn't cross over very much with the heavyweights in kind of, you know, noise music as we think of it. But they'll still describe their music as, like, you know, they'll put out an album and they'll say extra tone, comma, splitter core, comma, noise, right? So they're thinking about, they're aware of the genres, even if there's not a lot of overlap in terms of the individual artists from each genre interacting one another. But a lot of genres, when carried to their absolute extreme, kind of become noise, right? Like forms of metal, forms of punk, which I guess is not surprising, but kind of interesting.
Yeah. Let's see, what was I going to ask you next?
We were instructed not to read the chat. It's hard because there's this little red thing that says new messages.
Yeah, I managed to somehow hide mine, luckily. But what was I going to ask you about? So what's, I mean, we might have touched on this already, but I'm still curious about it. How kind of nerve-wracking is it to write about genres where, luckily in the speedcore part, it doesn't seem as big a deal, but I know almost every time I've written about noise, at least one person's going to tell me, well, that's not noise.
Right.
And what gets put in and left out of every one of these subgenres is always so kind of ludicrously controversial. how do you kind of overcome the fear of being, because you're going to get, I guess you're going to get that criticism no matter what you write, so you can kind of ignore,
Yeah.
but still there's got to be a voice in your head sometimes saying, am I really including the right and stuff in here, or is some of this should be elsewhere, or some of it should not be in here at all, things like that.
Yeah, it's agonizing, and I've tried to avoid that by, as opposed to kind of making the chapters about genres or tags, to instead sort of use like the variable that's carried to its extreme. So fast, loud, soft, found music, as a way of trying to sidestep that. So it's not going to rub people the wrong way as much. But it's I don't know, like, you know, my training, I'm a physician by training, and so, you know, in medicine we focus so much on empiricism, and so I experience a lot of anxiety putting together a book like this, which is basically a book of facts and stories, because I'm like, what if I'm wrong about this one thing? How much can I interpret? Because if I interpret, it's subject to, you know, being incorrect. Or what if someone tells me something and it's wrong? And I guess these are probably things that challenges a lot of authors face. But I find it really, I find that to be very anxiety provoking. Like, what if I give something the wrong label, or what if I describe something in the wrong way? And I'm sure I have, because it's inevitable, and I hope no one blames me. But I don't know if is that a common experience that music critics and authors have, this agony of, what if I describe something in a way that people disagree with?
Yeah, which is, it's hard to shed, because you really ultimately you can't really worry about that too much. But I'm sure everybody who's ever written a book that had any definition of style or kind of music or label has to worry about this, because you've read books yourself where you disagreed with them. So
Right.
you know somebody's going to disagree with them. Yeah. So I think maybe this might be a good time for some Q&A, unless there's anything else you would like to discuss about your book before people ask their questions. Or
I'm game to delve into this.
cool.
The chat.
Great. Yeah, this seems like perfect timing now. We have some questions from the chat. Just a reminder to everybody that if other things occur to you as the first few questions go, please feel free to add a few more. We should have a bit of time to get to everybody. These first couple here are not, I'm not entirely sure whether they were intended as questions for the Q&A, but we'll try them out. Max Glenn, did you want to unmute and ask your question about the core labeling taxonomy?
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of got touched upon throughout, but I noticed that I'm into like nightcore and breakcore music, and I just find that the core suffix is really common in electronic genres. And so I was just wondering what about it has stuck around for so long. I feel like, you know, genres kind of undergo changes over time, but this seems to have really stuck with the core. And so I'm wondering, like, what is it about electronic music and like getting to the core of something like shaman core, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, it's a great question that I haven't thought about. I guess it all stems from hardcore. I guess that's the origin of this, which may have been borrowed from hardcore punk and applied to electronic music. I could be wrong about that. So I'm trying to think if there's anything before hardcore punk that was described via core. Feel free to chime in if anyone has any ideas.
Pornography.
Yeah. So I guess from hardcore pornography. So I guess it's coming from that, and it's meant to like itself describe kind of an extreme form of an existing genre or existing world of sound. But it's interesting how it's just kind of been carried forward, right? So it's hardcore punk and then hardcore rave music, and then everyone sort of stuck with core. I guess metal was doing the same thing with grindcore. I don't know. I guess it just sounds good.
Yeah, it has a Watergate aspect to it too, where just gate gets put on everything and core gets put on everything now, because really the hard and the hardcore is really the more important part, but core does seem to evoke that it gets down to the center of it. I mean, the fact that there's slow core,
Right.
it's always been kind of funny to me, even though it still kind of makes sense.
Cuddle core.
Yeah, Josh Glenn in the comments was just saying the same thing that I was about to say too, which is that's actually a good example of what you were talking about with parody, because a lot of this, you know, a lot of the core labels are kind of start as jokes and then they become genre names. So, and the whole style is a bit of a joke that way. So yeah, it's kind of funny that way. Rob Drew, do you want to ask your question about artists and scientists?
Yeah, thank you. That was really stimulating. And I was just wondering whether there is conversation between artists and fans in this genre, and possibly people who do research on hearing. And I think Gus Stadler said in reaction to my comment, just thinking about research on digital versus analog processing or on compression, all the research John Stern did on compression and perception of it. So whether, you know, research may be on the limits of how many beats per minute people can perceive, or even yourself as a physician, you mentioned, Michael, whether it becomes painful or uncomfortable at some point, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can't say I haven't seen like much crossover between, you know, true acoustic scientists and these you know, arcane forms of electronic music. But I'll say that, you know, when Extratone came about, it was really the artists Laurentium and Heinrich 3600 BPM. So they really saw themselves as pushing this to a scientific level. It was sort of like, it was a bit of a pseudoscientific thing. So they'd post these like complicated kind of manifestos about, you know, what it means when music reaches a certain number of beats per minute and the significance of this transformation from beat to tone. A lot of what survives is actually these YouTube videos attributed to Heinrich 3600 BPM, which is just like his music and then a white screen with this text. And they'll be like 20 minutes long, and it'll just be text of all these calculations and things. So I think they really saw themselves as pushing this boundary, and were attributing certain important audiological characteristics to certain thresholds of sound. So that's kind of the closest things got to there being this scientific edge of speedcore. And I don't know much about the validity of it. Some of it seemed very, you know, some of it would get kind of sort of mystical and stuff. There's another subgenre which I alluded to called flashcore, which is less about specific numbers and more about creating, you know, just experimental music that's something like noise that's meant to be very abstract and artistic. And I think they also have this kind of quasi-science sort of mystical thing going on. I don't know much about audiology myself. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, so a lot of my patients have hearing loss. It is certainly true, and you can hear it in the music that once the music reaches a certain point, it's just a tone. I don't know if I have too much else to say about it, but certainly some people would sort of position themselves as kind of approaching this from a scientific level.
That question leads pretty well into Charles Thompson's question about other instruments. Charles, you there?
I can read it aloud if you'd like.
Yeah. Now I'm having trouble finding it too.
I have the question here. So
Go ahead.
Do the notes of the instruments other than percussion also proceed at these extreme tempos, e.g. 128th note, 256th note, etc.? Um, yes. It's primarily about the beats, so not necessarily. And again, often it'll flip from, you know, a relatively normal beat to just a really, really rapid beat for a few seconds. And so I haven't seen a fully annotated score. So I can't answer the question definitively, but often really the focus is on the beats, and some of the tracks will kind of like become sort of purely percussive for periods of time, when it, you know, when reaching those tempos before reverting to something that might have a sample being looped or a synthesizer line.
Thank you.
Alex Reed, questions about producers versus artists versus consumers.
Yeah, thank you for this, Michael. I'm really, really enjoying your talk, and I can't wait to read your book. One of the things that strikes me as interesting, and this kind of came to mind when you were talking about like the tempo definitions of different styles here, is that these are stylistic definitions being set by the producers, and you're interviewing the producers, and I wonder, is there like a separate fan base of people who really just like listen to this stuff, or in the sort of folk tradition way, if we're talking about folk as being a communal join-in kind of a thing, is it the case in extreme music that there is a more permeable border between producer and artist, and for that matter, that there's a higher ratio of artists to audience than you might get in like the pop world?
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head. As the further you push to the extreme, you see this collapsing of the, you know, the artist audience boundary. And so for a lot of these scenes, harsh noise wall, gore grind, you name it, you'll see, you know, the producers are also the audience members, and they're just sharing the stuff they created with one another. At the same time, it's sort of hard to know, right? Because the audience in some ways remains invisible when you look at the online footprint. I think for when it comes to speedcore, there's kind of an upper echelon of artists who are not going to 500 beats per minute on a regular basis, but they're in that 250 to 400 BPM range, and they'll have live shows, right, where they'll play this music alongside gabber and alongside terrorcore, which is like a hard and fast metal samples, but not necessarily 500 BPM genre. And so there you'll see audience members who are drawn to it. But the further extreme you go, there's definitely this collapsing between artist and listener, for sure.
There's a great quote in the harsh noise wall that I typed it when I was reading in the section about harsh noise wall. I forget who said it, but he said, less people listen to harsh noise wall than make it.
Yeah, I mean, like these are just small scenes. You go to these shows and it's like 8 guys in a basement, right?
Yeah.
And like half of them have their own labels, you know, so.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a folk art, right? Yes, to those who've been to a harsh noise show, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. These are ideals that get talked about in some scenes, right, where there's no line between the artist and the audience, but then you wonder how much that is kind of a communal ideal when it becomes like 5 guys. So whether that really works the same way. Ian Mathers, I think your question overlapped a little bit with Alex's, but I think there were some things that you could distinguish if you want to unmute and ask that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's kind of related. So similar to the way that you might go to a harsh noise wall show and, you know, might make harsh noise wall. Something that you were saying earlier, Michael, I think you're saying like, oh, I don't necessarily listen to a bunch of extra tone compilations in my free time, sort of for funsies. And to sort of, but we're also talking about, I agree with your proposition that there's value in these sort of very extreme musics. And it seems like part of what we're saying is, even when you don't sort of get a sort of visceral or direct value from it, right? Like there's music we all listen to because we enjoy the visceral experience of listening to it. But and that's certainly a kind of value. And it's not that these values, there's not a really hard, bright line, right? Like you could viscerally enjoy something, but there's also some abstract qualities of it that might be interesting, otherwise valuable. When you've been sort of investigating these more extreme extreme music scenes, do you ever get a sense that, like, the people who actually make it, who are deeply invested enough in it to want to create it, does it seem like they're doing it more because they get like a visceral direct value out of it, or do you think there's some of them, or maybe most of them, are pursuing sort of a more abstract sort of value? Does that make sense? Like, and again, maybe those things, I'm sure those things do blur to some extent, but are there just people out there who just like cannot get enough of the sound of extra tone and they're going to keep making it no matter what, or at least some of them sort of more like investigating things or trying to figure out something they'll bring back to less extreme music? Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a thing that I wondered a lot, and a question I tried to pose to people, like, how extreme is too extreme? Do you listen to this stuff for fun, or what makes a good speedcore track, splittercore track, etc.? A lot of the producers who I talked to would describe this process of approaching music where I started listening to dance music and I just couldn't get enough of things being hard and fast, and so I was constantly on the lookout for things that are harder and faster, and so I ended up here. So that's the familiar story, and my sense is that I think the zone of no one's impervious to the zone of fruitless intensification, right? Are people spending all of their time listening above 1,000 beats per minute? That's not the sense I got. The sense I got is that there'd be a lot of terrorcore or gabber, kind of the more accessible original genres, where people spent a lot of their listening time at. And then they would dabble in these other things more for conceptual reasons or for the intellectual sort of joy of knowing, like, I've carried through this passion for fast music as far as it could go. But I mean, I don't speak for everyone. Like, Merzbow is famous for saying, if by noise, I'm going to butcher this quote, but basically the point is, pop music is noise to him. He enjoys noise music. That's what he listens to. Stuff that people consider pop is just noise and unpleasant to him. So there are probably people out there who just like love the thrill of like music getting progressively faster and faster, and then that like transgression into a tone. Yeah, I've not answered your question directly. I'll say that my joy came from understanding things intellectually and conceptually rather than listening to them a lot of the time.
I think you did, though, because it's really, again, like, there's not going to be, it's not like you're going to, even if you did a survey and people were doing their best to answer sincerely, you're not going to get like, 63% of extra tone producers are just in it for the love of the game, and the other, whatever percent are like trying to, figure out something conceptually they can take back to their rock band. If they ever really does that. But no, so thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks. I'm going to bump Christina Ward up because this conversation is going on in the chat. And also, I want to take the second to thank Christina, who's Michael's publisher, for helping bring Marc into this conversation when we were in the last stages of trying to get it organized. So Christina, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yes, thank you everyone. And I was slow on the unmute. And I'm curious. I'm seeing this is a very dude genre. In your research, Michael, did you come across any women working in the super speed core and all of its related subgenres?
Yeah, and you're right. It's a very dude genre, and it's either a dude genre or an anonymous person genre, as in people who are just a moniker without a name, which is unfortunately true of a lot of the extreme music genres covered. The one exception I can think of amongst the stuff that I've talked about here is Pengo, who is generally attributed as being the creator of splittercore when she put out the seminal DJ set that begat the term. And so that is raw, as far as I can recall, the only sort of prominent woman who's a producer within this world of music. And I can't say I did an exhaustive inventory of all the producers, so I'm sure there are others. And I'm sure there are also some who don't sort of refer to themselves by name. But that's the most prominent example that I'm aware of. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question though. I wonder what it's like in harsh noise wall. There's a number of noise artists who are women, but I've never seen harsh noise wall. I'm trying to think. Yeah. I'm looking at the subsequent responses to your question in the chat.
Now. You'll get to see all of this. We're going to send you a transcript of the chat afterwards, so you'll see all of it then.
It's looks like a really rich discussion.
Yeah. Florian, you had several questions. Could you choose your favorite and pose it?
I'm going to try to recall them. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So since a lot of the other stuff has already been touched on, I wanted to get back to kind of like what you outlined as conceptual extremes. So like, it's defined by 1000 beats per minute, and kind of like these experiential extremes we touched upon, like that to experience that stuff, experience the transition from a rhythm to a pitch to a tone, you need that contrast. And I wanted to ask you if you see a relationship between kind of like the importance and proliferation of like labeling and kind of like having to kind of like focus on these conceptual extremes, while also like having like, still like having to obey to some musical conventions to make them also open to experience. And yeah, and I guess I go like to the last question to like just shoehorn it in there, like the question of technological resistance, because this goes back all the way to the beginning to kind of like the pissing contest. How can you have bragging rights for like going as fast as whatever, when all you need to do is like program it and your computer can do anything?
Yeah. Yes, that's a good point. So I'll answer the second question first because I remember it since I just heard it. So I think of another thing that's covered in the book is Black MIDI, which is sort of the purest example of this phenomenon that I can think of. So not the band Black MIDI, which is now all that comes up if you search Black MIDI, but the people who are creating these MIDI files using graphical interfaces where you could see all the notes and pitch, up on a screen. And then the key was, how can we put as many notes as possible in one composition by like individually filling them in this program. So it would often be video game tracks from video game scores, and they would do cover versions that would involve as many notes as possible, like 256th notes. And then there was this huge sort of battle to see who could create the most notes. So it would be like there was a big fanfare when someone did 1 million, and then it went higher than that. So that retained its musicality because they would retain you could still hear the melody and stuff. You're right, there's something completely arbitrary about creating a track that has 600,000 beats per minute, because it's all just going to, all you've done is set a program and to spit it out automatically. And like we've said, everything kind of becomes noise at its most extreme. But it's still kind of like I think people get off on the thrill of like, we're the first to do this. I'm the first to do this. I'll put it on the cover. I'll put it on the YouTube title. It'll say 1 billion notes. Yeah, but you're right. If it's just a computer putting it together, it's sort of lost the thrill, lost the challenge. I've forgotten the first question, but it was very good.
It was kind of a question of like how people define genres, because there's the conceptual extremes. It's defined by that 1000 beat thing versus experiential extremes, where you can actually hear it as being extreme, which requires some contrast, I would argue, and which I know exists in a lot of speedcore. not in harsh noise wall, but kind of like how people negotiate it, because they need to disavow some of like the slow parts of the song to. I just like want you to speak to that, like this topic, because it fascinates me.
As in, you need to have, like, in order to get the thrill of the fast parts, you need to have the contrast between the normal BPM parts and the.
Well, some techniques like extra tone, you like it comes from like if it's just a tone, like it's not the effect of something transitioning from the slower rhythm into the realm of like where it's so fast that it becomes a pitch, and that's the kind of like this problem of like like having your concept that's associated with the genre versus having it be audible.
Yes. Yeah, and that's a big tension. Like, because a track will be labeled as having 2,000 beats per minute, but it'll just be for 2 seconds within the middle of the track somewhere, because it's really about the build up, or the sudden doubling of a beat until it reaches a certain threshold. So you're absolutely right that the genre is being described. The genre is used to describe what's ultimately like 2 seconds of one composition, and the joy is all about that transformation from a relatively normal dance track to a very fast one. Yeah.
We've only got a few minutes left, but I want to get Gus's question in before we go.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks, Michael, for the talk and the discussion. So I was curious about, given the kind of legacy of the relationship between EDM and drugs and like recreational drugs, and I mean, in some ways, I think maybe this question comes back to the issue of perception, but the idea that like certain drugs allow you to perceive certain things about particular kinds of music that you wouldn't ordinarily otherwise perceive. I'm just wondering if there is a kind of drug culture at all around this world that that's generalizable in any way. I mean, I was also struck by when you were talking about that sort of need for more, the need for more beats per minute or whatever, like that sort of the sort of drugginess of that construction of needing like a bigger dose for high or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, that's just curious about that.
Yeah. And when it comes to some of the early genres like happy hardcore versus gabber, right? My sense is happy hardcore was primarily an ecstasy driven scene, and gabber was maybe more about the purer forms of speed and amphetamine. Although I bet Simon Reynolds could speak to that more authoritatively than I could. You're absolutely right how the genre prioritizes this idea of hard and fast and the constant seeking of a new high of beats per minute. It very much feels like a kind of escalating dopamine hit, druggy sort of thing. And certainly some of the cover art, some of the titles, right, like drugs and altered states are a big part of the way people think about this music. Not all. I guess it's always a challenge with music that's shifted to being a largely online phenomena, right? As opposed to stuff that's being played live, DJ sets and stuff. That stuff exists, but not so much for like the extra tone side. So it's like, are people kind of producing tracks at home, using drugs at the same time? I'm not sure. It appears in the artwork. And I think that's a important way of understanding the evolution of electronic music as a whole and the creation of the hardcore rave and drum and bass and some of the more extreme forms that were popular amongst in raves. Yeah, it's a great question. Should have posed it to some of the producers more specifically. So it's part of the it's part of the way the music is promoted, but I don't know how people are using this stuff individually.
Great, thank you. So yeah, it's been a great session. I want to thank Michael and Marc for sharing their time with us today, and everybody who contributed questions. That was a really great discussion. And you can all see how far we could go right down rabbit holes with this discussion, basically based on one chapter. So so it's exciting to think of all the areas that this book can open up. Again, thanks to everyone. And I just want to remind you to come back in 2 weeks for our disco themed session. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.